Hey guys, Mulligan here, and today I actually wanted to discuss Elysian Midrange, my experiences I've had with the deck and where I think the archetype is at now, and the possible places it could end up going. I will be going through my deck list, but just to preface, this is not a deck tech. This is more of a discussion piece. I will be touching on the cards that I have used in previous versions of the deck as well, and whether or not you should be running them. Uh, Before we do anything else though, just to give some background on myself, I have been playing Eternal since late October, so about a month before the closed beta ended. I've hit Master every season in open beta, except for Season 1, but I'm not a super high Master rank player. I did briefly hit top 100 once last season, but I don't consider myself a top player at all. I, I did use Elysian Midrange as part of my rotation in my climb to Master though, even after I hit the Master rank, so hopefully you guys can learn something from this, mainly from my mistakes and building and tweaking the deck. And I also hope that some top players can at least get one thing from this discussion as well, despite my current level in ranked play. All that was just to say that I'm not trash at this game. And while I'm not a top player, I consider myself capable, is the best word I can think of. But I'm going to go over to the deck list here. But just to let you guys know, I have been playing Elysian Midrange since the beginning of open beta. And I've got over 150 ladder games with the deck. And if you add tournament matches, I'm close to 200 games overall, which is not a lot. But I rotate between several decks when climbing ladder in a given season. And this deck has stayed in my rotation for the entirety of open beta up until this point. Because of the way I'm structuring this, I don't necessarily want to call this a primer either, but maybe that's how this will turn out, who knows. And I'll start off by saying that as far as when I first built the deck, I went the super janky route, and we are talking Whispering Echosaurus Lightning Ball route, for those of you that follow Lightning Ball's Eternal blog, where I was running Whispering Wind, Unstable Form, and Twin Brood Sauropod, trying to go for a more aggressive tempo style list that topped out at 5 power. Over time I did tweak the list closer to what you see in more standard builds, and I want to say if I had to do it over again, I would not have started this way. The archetype didn't really start gaining traction until the end of February when, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Caladinus took Elysian Midrange from the 800 ranks in Master all the way into top 100 and got close to top 50 if I recall correctly. And that list was very standard with no tech cards or jank choices at all. And I'll actually leave a link to the thread, to the Reddit thread, in the description box below if you guys want to check that out. But it's better to just build decks this way and sprinkle in fringe or underplayed cards as you go. I've kind of learned this the hard way. But and I say this because if you start super janky like I did, you tend to hold on to cards for a bit too long without realizing they aren't as good after that one tweak you just made. And I know that a lot of people already know this, but I just wanted to say that to aspiring deck builders that have less experience in card games in general. Another thing I've realized throughout this whole process is the way I had to realize once again there is a certain way that I like to build my mid-range decks. I usually like to build them leaning more towards aggression and curving out with units. Coming from Hearthstone, it makes sense, but thinking back, I even did this in Magic the Gathering when I played many years ago. So I like to have a very high threat density in my mid-range decks, that higher than most lists that you see out there. Something like Stone Scar Midrange is a pretty good example of that, and I honestly feel Elysian Midrange should be built the same way. The units that Elysian has access to just make this more obvious, in my opinion, if you just go through all of set 1. But yeah, let's talk about the list that I've been running up until this point. This is the list I ran during the final Eternal Tournament Series Weekly for Season 3 and the Last Chance Qualifier. And another thing I want to give fair warning on, even though I am not running Xenon Obelisk in this list, I am going to be mentioning it a lot as I go through the deck list. So first off, for Initiate of the Sands, this card is, I'd say it's basically core at this point. Though there was a time I thought about cutting this card entirely. The reason was its usefulness drops so much as you start getting into the mid game with 4 or more power, especially if you're not running Xenon Obelisk. And I wanted to run a more impactful card over this. But I've realized that this card is a necessary evil. It allows for turn 2 Dawnwalkers and sometimes turn 2 False Prince. And it also allows the infamous turn 3 Sandstorm Titan. That reason alone kept them in this list, despite not running Xenon Obelisk. And of course, if you are running said card, they do get better. But turn 2 False Prince or Dawnwalker and turn 3 Sandstorm Titan is unfair. And we want to do unfair things with our decks. Next is 3 Permafrost. The best quote-unquote removal that Primal has access to. There's really not much else to say. I personally think this card is core in the deck, and I wouldn't run less than 3. It provides huge tempo swings, breaks board stalls that don't have Sandstorm Titan sitting across from you. It promotes aggression for a minimal cost, which is what this deck wants. 4 Seek Power. Now, Seek Power, in earlier builds, I ran 27 power with no Seek Power, and my power curve topped out at 5. Looking back, that was very greedy, and eventually I paid for it in my games. I bit the bullet and decided to run 4 of these, and the deck runs much smoother than it did before. And I'll touch more on the power base and what my stats are as far as power screw or flood. But I will say in this deck, you can't really run less than 31 power sources. Anything less, in my opinion, is too risky. Now, with the recent patch that came out today as of the recording of this video, there is a new redraw system which might change this. But if it doesn't for some reason, then if you can run more than 31 power sources in your list, I probably would. 2 Lightning Storm. So these were originally thrown in as a nod to Rakano, Shimmer Pack, and later on Jito decks, because that was the meta in the beginning of open beta up until very recently. But with patch 1.18 nerfing some key cards ran in Stone Scar decks, the meta shifted heavily towards Combre based decks, and there's been a lot of other mid-range decks running around recently. So in a mid-range metagame, I looked to cut this card first. In my case, I held on to it for so long, mainly because Shimmer Pack was still running around, but Lightning Storm isn't always good against them anyway. And it also has anti-synergy with Initiate of the Sands, Dawnwalker, and Whispering Wind, since there's no Xenon Obelisk. So, looking into the 2 drops that I have, I've got 3 Stormlinks. This was originally thrown in as a nod to Rakano after trying out other 2 drops in conjunction with Whispering Wind. Stormlinks is also good against other low to the ground aggro decks like Jito or Burn Queen, and it's okay versus Armory. That said, I'm not super comfortable calling this a core card, as on its own it isn't that strong, particularly in this more mid-range meta, but obviously this card gets better if you're running Xenon Obelisk. Okay, for Whispering Wind. Now, before you guys close the video, just let me explain why these are in here. I have tested this, I have tested Temple Scribe, and I have tested Friendly Wisp. And I'm just going to put it out there. In an Elysian Midrange deck that is not running Xenon Obelisk, Whispering Wind might be the best 2-drop for Elysian Midrange. I don't know why people aren't trying this card. There is a misconception that this card is bad because there's nothing you would want to discard since you only run good cards in your deck. The problem with that argument is that your good cards aren't good at every stage of the game. Example, Initiate of the Sands. Do you really want to keep that Initiate of the Sands that you just top decked in the late game? The only reason you keep it is if it's going to act as your 8th power for Xenon Obelisk, or you're already at 8 power and you have 2 Obelisks out. What about Dawnwalkers? Do you not want to play free Dawnwalkers? This card allows that. Other examples of cards that I pitched to this, Ageless Mentor, extra power that I don't need, Lightning Storm if it's not good in a particular matchup, and other Whispering Winds, in addition to the said Dawnwalkers and Initiate of the Sands. I'd say even in the more standard builds with Xenon Obelisk, it may still be better than Friendly Wisp and Temple Scribe. The card is just so good. It mitigates Power Flood. That makes it a better late game top deck than Friendly Wisp and Temple Scribe in my eyes, since you tend to flood out late game in my experience. Amazing synergy with Dawnwalker. I cannot tell you guys how many times I've done turn 2 Whispering Wind, turn 3 attack with it, discard Dawnwalker to get a 4+ cost card, play False Prince end of turn, and have 10 power already on board going into turn 4. That's unfair, and you want to do unfair things with this deck. Unfair things are what makes decks good in any card game. But I'll touch on my thoughts on Temple Scribe and Friendly Wisp as well. For Temple Scribe, the biggest reason that I stopped playing it was the double time influence requirement. It's tough to cast on turn 2 consistently, and I suspect this is the reason why you see some lists running as little as 2 copies of it. Yes, it replaces itself. Yes, it gains you 1 life, which usually doesn't matter. Yes, it gets a little better with an Obelisk in play, but at the end of the day, a pseudo tutor effect for a chance to get what you need by pitching something you don't need is better than a one-time cycle, especially if the effect is ongoing. As far as Friendly Wisp goes, I did switch over to Friendly Wisp as I got my list closer to what is deemed standard, and I was pretty disappointed. You would think Friendly Wisp is a good card because it provides incidental card advantage when activated, which is what mid-range decks want. But without Xenon Obelisk, the card is largely not very good. Even though it has a Wisdom of the Elders effect attached, it's a one-time thing, and the opponent can just ignore it after it goes off. Unlike Whispering Wind, whose effect is constant. I've also learned that mid-range decks should rely on card quality. At least this one should. Not card quantity. And pseudo-tutoring with Whispering Wind is, I think, still better than even drawing 2 cards. I don't even think Friendly Wisp gets much better even if you are running Xenon Obelisk, unless once again you're at 8 power and or you have 2 Obelisks out. And what unit doesn't get better in that situation? So I will admit Whispering Wind is a very difficult card to use. But just because a card is difficult to use does not make it bad. If you're not running Obelisks, play this card. If you are, at the very least consider it and try it out. I think you'll be surprised. Alright, moving over to the 3-drops, which I believe is the most important slot for Elysian Midrange. Along with the 4th slot, of course. But 3 Ageless Mentors. So, a little backstory. When I first built this deck at the very beginning of open beta, I built it around this card. I was intrigued by its potential. The original thought process of running this over Obelisk was that I would get the +2/+2 buff from my important cards immediately, versus having to wait until 8 power with Obelisk. Keep in mind that Cerso was actually the top of my power curve up until very, very recently. And after playing with Ageless Mentor for several months, though, I think it's time for her to go. While you do get a +2 buff right away, it obviously only works with the 4 cost or higher cards already in your hand. And on average, you only have one of those in hand if you're dropping this on turn 3. Hitting 2 cards is great, and I don't think I've ever lost a game where I've hit 3 cards or more. But at the end of the day, Ageless Mentor is just too inconsistent, even if you build a deck with a higher power curve with her in mind. For that reason, Xenon Obelisk is likely just better, and I plan to slot Obelisk in over this card. I was originally of the school of thought that Obelisk doesn't belong in this style of deck because it doesn't flood the board like Shimmer Pack does, but at the very least, it's become a necessary evil because all the other Elysian Midrange decks are running Xenon Obelisk. And yes, you need a board for it to be effective, but you often have a board, and it makes all your units bigger, not just the 4 cost or higher ones. And I imagine Dawnwalker also gets activated more often. So for anyone thinking about running Ageless Mentor, I wouldn't bother. It's just not worth it. Xenon Obelisk is just broken, and it should probably be the go-to choice instead. So next we're going to talk about Dawnwalker and False Prince. The Dawnwalker False Prince package, I guess, is a better, more appropriate name. But starting with the Dawnwalkers, both of the cards are core in this archetype, in my opinion. But Dawnwalker has excellent synergy with Whispering Wind, as I mentioned before. It wrecks Armory's Day. It provides some protection from board wipes, as long as you don't overcommit to the board. You are sad when it gets silenced, but at least something else won't get silenced, like Cerso or Mystic Ascendant or Champion of Wisdom or Sandstorm Titan, for what it's worth. False Prince. Basically, if your opponent can't deal with a 5/5 on turn 3, they're usually in trouble. It's also pretty good bait for removal, so that your real cards can potentially go unanswered. I'm mainly talking about Torch, but you're happy if an opponent vanquishes False Prince, because at least it still leaves behind a token, and then that's a vanquish they don't have for your higher cost units like Sandstorm Titan, Cerso, Mystic Ascendant. If they torch it, that means they won't have a torch for your Dawnwalker. But this, along with Dawnwalker, gives the deck the aggressive stance that it has. Alright, so now I want to talk about Polymorph. And I'm sure some people are wondering why Polymorph is in here over something like Scorpion Wasp. And I'll explain. In this style of deck, I prefer Polymorph over Scorpion Wasp simply because it's just more proactive. I am on record saying that Scorpion Wasp is overrated. In a proactive deck, I just don't like using removal that relies on your opponent doing something. And that is exactly what Wasp is most of the time. It's a reactive card. Wasp is better than Polymorph versus Rakano and decks running Ikaria. But the other card that those decks run is Torch. And I've lost count of how many times I needed Wasp to get rid of something versus Rakano, or get rid of Ikaria herself while I was defending in combat. What's a good example? Rakano having a Crown Watch Paladin with Deep Force Plate equipped on it. I play the Wasp and it gets torched down because my opponent wisely waited until 6 power to put the plate on Crown Watch Paladin and hold up the last power for Torch. Or 8 power in Ikaria's case. And even when Wasp gets rid of something that has a Deep Force Plate on it, it's not great since you still took a ton of damage. And Polymorph also helps in board stall situations where you'd normally have great attacks if that Sandstorm Titan wasn't in your way. Instead of waiting for your opponent to make a mistake by attacking, you just turn it into a 1/1 and crash in with your guys. I've honestly thought about going up to 3 copies, but I'm afraid I'd draw Polymorph a bit too much if I did, so I've kept it at 2 copies for now. Alright, so we're moving into our 4-cost units here. And I do want to start off with Champion of Wisdom. Um, because some lists run her and other lists don't. Uh, I want to say ever since the stats were buffed, because this used to be a 3-3, now it was buffed to a 4-4 in patch 1.18. But I've been thoroughly impressed with her. I honestly want to run 3 copies, as 2 has not felt like enough for me. Before, when she was a 3-3, you were basically required to run Elysian Stranger as a 2-drop, so you could hit the influence requirements by turn 4 if you wanted to run Champion of Wisdom. But now you don't have to wait to hit the 4 influence requirement before playing her anymore, unlike before when she was a 3-3 and was vulnerable to Torch. Because a lot of the time you can just drop her on the table on curve and she'll usually come back to you. Getting silence sucks, but that means silence is not targeting your Dawnwalker or Cerso. And though people I face usually ignore her until after she's fully online. And they usually pay for it more often than not, because they don't have the removal to take care of her, or they ended up using silence on something else. But it's excellent versus decks that are weak to flyers, like Shimmer Pack. And after an Ageless Mentor buff and hitting all your influence requirements, an 8/8 flyer, it was a pretty nice clock for me when it did happen. 2 Praxis Displacers. Criminally underrated. I used to run 3 copies in earlier builds, and back when the power curve was a bit lower. And I used to blow people out when I curved into this with a 2 and 3 drop on the board. And then if I had another copy and I played it on turn 5, it was just an instant win, since no one can really afford to be time walked back to back. But she was also great if she got a mentor buff as well, since that made her a 5/4, and then that would activate Dawnwalker. But all this being said, the card has fallen off a bit in this meta. It's great against Rakano and Stonescar. It's decent versus Combre, but it's not amazing. And it is absolutely terrible versus Armory and Shimmer Pack, since a lot of their units have summon effects that you don't want them to be used again by bouncing them back to their hand. But you also can use it to remove permafrost from one of your own guys, but those cases are pretty rare, and you'd rather save it for something like a Titan if you're facing Shimmer Pack. Because of this though, after Lightning Storm and Ageless Mentor, this would be the next card to go. For Sandstorm Titan, there's literally nothing to say. It's standard in basically every deck running time ever. And it's the reason why you play most time decks, why you're in time in the first place. Moving on. For Cerso, it's core to this archetype. It often wins you the game if it goes unanswered. It is awful versus go wide decks like Jito and Shimmer Pack, but I would not bother running this deck at all if you don't have these. 4 is absolutely core. So I'm running 1 Crystallize, or I have been running 1 Crystallize up until this point. Because in previous metas you could get away with running 1. In the current meta up to this point, 1 is incorrect, and you would need to run at least 2 of these. And I paid for it dearly during the Eternal Tournament Series weekly and the Last Chance Qualifier. The card just breaks board stalls versus other mid-range decks and allows you to finish the game, which is what this archetype needs. And I think 2 may just still be correct in general, in hindsight, because even in an aggro meta, this card is not terrible. It does something. So I wanted to try out 2 Mystic Ascendant. I did try this card previously, but I wanted to come back to it. Surprisingly, it's just not that good in Elysian Midrange. I think the reasoning is that Elysian Midrange is not big Combre. It doesn't have an amazing late game package to fall back on like big Combre does, with with this card, Marshall Ironthorn, the Great Parliament, and Seraph. And for that reason, I think this archetype needs to end the game before then, as you just can't keep up with them, even if you're also running Mystic Ascendant. I originally had this in just as another form of card draw. I wanted more card draw, because you do tend to run out of gas if the game starts to go late. As far as cards to play. But it's tough to get to turn 7 though. Even with Initiates in the deck. And Ascendant, it doesn't break board stalls. It promotes them, if anything. Which, if the game starts going late, that's not what you want. I think a card like Predatory Carnosaur is probably better, in my opinion. And again, you want to rely on card quality, not quantity, in mid-range decks in general. Although Big Combre is somewhat of an exception to that. This Big Combre is just a different beast altogether. Okay, so going over to the power base. So I'm running 8 Time Sigils, 6 Primal Sigils, 2 Amber Monuments, 3 Diplomatic Seals, 4 of the banners, and 4 of the seats for Elysian. I want to preface this by saying that the recent change in the redraw system allows you a guaranteed 2, 3, or 4 power when you redraw, and each has an equal chance of happening. Unlike before, where you could draw 2 to 5 power guaranteed on the redraw, but you had the highest chance of getting 2 power, and then if getting 3 power was a slightly lower chance than getting 2, and getting 4 was a lower chance of getting 3, and so on and so forth. So the chances decreased on a scale. If you guys, hopefully you guys understand that. But the new system also guarantees your initial hand will also have 2 to 4 power in it. In the old system, a lot of players operated off the theory of only running the bare minimum amount of actual power in your deck, no matter what type of deck you were running, so aggro, mid-range, or control. And you would just run power fixing cards if you wanted additional sources. I am personally not a fan of this mindset, because not only were you relying on the redraw to bail you out, but you are assuming that you will draw your fixing cards within the first few turns, as particularly as a mid-range or control deck. And those fixing cards do not count towards the guaranteed power that you get on a redraw in the old system. I look at it like this. Some people are willing to risk their entire deck not functioning just to get 2 to 3 more slots for actual cards. And I'm not willing to do that. But in any case, I'm definitely going to go back and review this power base, and everything I mentioned going forward about this power base is going to be based off the old redraw system. But for now, I've got a total of 31 power sources in this deck. The 4 Seek power along with the 27 power that I just mentioned. And based on other lists I've seen, I am running a little higher than what is considered normal. However, I'd say that in any Elysian midrange deck, they need to be running this at the bare minimum. This power base is derived from the Karsten theory in Magic the Gathering and has been adopted by some of the top players in Eternal. I Read Minds initially brought it to light with a Reddit post, and Manu S has also adopted this as well, and I'll leave a link in the description box below to the Reddit thread that I Read Minds posted for those interested in learning more about that theory. And Manu S also did a video series on his channel, which will also be linked in the top right of this video and the description box below. So anyone that was complaining about Power Screw or Power Flood needs to look at those videos and read the Reddit thread. I've almost never been power screwed since adopting that theory to my deck list, and I do keep track of those stats in a given season. And I think I've gotten to as low as a 4% power screw rate over all my games in a given season, which is extremely good. In my experience, I did tend to flood a bit with this power base, but the low rate of power screw up that I've experienced is worth it, honestly. Plus cards like Whispering Wind, the Amber Monuments, and even Mystic Ascendant, for what it's worth, they do help mitigate flood, which is actually the main reason for the 2 Amber Monument that I've got in here in the first place. The only thing that I might change about the power base is cutting a time sigil for a primal sigil. There have been games where it took a while to find my second primal influence, but having double time influence by turn 3 is so important for this deck, I feel. So I've just been afraid to make the change. So now I want to talk about other cards that I've tried. Some of these are going to be mentioned as a combination. Actually, most of these are going to be mentioned as a combination, now that I think about it. And some will just be mentioned standalone. But starting off, I want to talk about Unstable Form and Twin Brute Sauropod. And I mentioned before that the list I started with used this combination of cards. Unstable Form was something that popped Aegis for me versus decks like Rakano, and it was pseudo removal versus cards like Sandstorm Titan. It is also supposed to help you get lethal by turning either your own unit to something more favorable or their unit to something less favorable for them. But that literally happened once in all the time I played the card. Unstable Form was often also something I would pitch the extra copy to Whispering Wind if I needed to search for something else. But over time, I just started to hate the card, and the variance really got to me, even in spots where it was correct to use it. And I finally just cut it completely, and I wouldn't recommend running it unless you're going for a full jank build with Northwind Heralds or something. As far as Twin Brute Sauropod, that was actually a decent card, particularly against control decks thanks to the Echo. And when it got buffed from Ageless Mentor, the game was usually over. As a 5-power 7/6s, 2 5-power 7/6s are pretty tough to deal with outside of hard removal. And I eventually cut it though, since overall it just wasn't high impact enough. So the next combination of cards that I want to mention is Voice of the Speaker and Hatchery Hunter. So the theory behind this was that if I could give my power cards Echo, I could always have something to discard to Whispering Wind to actually find business in my deck. And whatever extra power I had left over in my hand, I could turn into 3/3 flyers with Hatchery Hunter. I only ran a single copy of Hatchery Hunter, though. But even if I ran more, the situation where I had excess power from Echo in hand was extremely rare. And with Rakano eating my 2 drops for lunch at the time, thanks to Crownwatch Paladin being a 2/2, I finally gave up on the idea and cut both of them. Okay, so Copper Conduit and Excavate, another combination of cards that I tried early on. Excavate was tested in conjunction with Unstable Form and Twin Brute Sauropod, actually, along with Copper Conduit. When I finally cut the Sauropods, Excavate was a lot less useful in my experience. After cutting Excavate, the same thing happened with Copper Conduit. I originally put Conduit in the deck as a curve filler and as a late game overwhelm unit that was a power sink. However, I didn't realize how much worse it got with Excavate being gone. And keep in mind, this was actually before Excavate got nerfed, and it could actually leave the void back then. But if I recall correctly, I'm not sure. Someone let me know in the comments. But anyway, with Conduit being below average without recursion, even as a curve filler, I just ended up cutting it. So Ancient Lore. I did run Ancient Lore because for some reason I forgot that Wisdom of the Elders existed in this game. It did kind of make sense with a unit heavy deck like this one, but it was just too slow for the effect. Even when you cast it late game and you don't hit 2 units a lot of the time. Anyway. But I was running 2. Then I dropped to 1 copy and then I just cut it all together. And I put in Wisdom of the Elders. Now, in my time testing Wisdom of the Elders, it is definitely better than Ancient Lore. Or Ancient Lore. Sorry, Hearthstone references here. But in a mid-range deck, you don't want a pure card advantage type of effect. You'd rather have a unit that provides incidental card advantage, or just not even have card advantage altogether and just rely on the quality of your cards instead. So I eventually cut the Wisdoms as well. Scorpion Wasp. I did play this in the Rakano meta to punish Aegis units, and overall it was unreliable. As I said earlier, if the Rakano or Ikaria player is dumb enough to tap out and then attack, then of course Wasp does wonders. It's amazing. But the more common case for me was that it gets played around and good players never make the attack without leaving power open to torch any Wasp shenanigans. And that happened to me a lot. So I cut them from polymorphs and I haven't looked back. Polymorph isn't as good against Rakano or decks playing Ikaria, but it's proactive, and that's more important to me. And last but definitely not least, Call the Ancients. So yes, I did try the Whispering Wind Call the Ancients combo, for those of you that were wondering. I pulled the combo off less than 10% of the time. Granted, I only ran one copy of Call the Ancients, but even if I ran more, I still think you don't pull off the combo more than 10% of the time. I would only run this if you go full jank, meaning 4 copies of Whispering Wind and probably 3 to 4 copies of Call the Ancients. Otherwise, stay away. So finally, I want to talk about where Elysian Midrange is at now and where it could possibly go. When patch 1.18 hit, a lot of people were trying Elysian Midrange out due to the nerfs to Stone Scar decks. Recently, however, I think Elysian Midrange has started to lose a little bit of its appeal with everyone playing Combrei-based decks. We're even seeing Time Justice Primal midrange decks, which take the best of both worlds from Big Combrei and Elysian Midrange. And it has been a very potent combination, both in ladder and in tournaments. That said, if you want to just stick with the 2-color classic version, I think Elysian Midrange is still fairly well positioned currently. Now, with the new promo card from Azindo's Ways that came out again today, as of the recording time of this video, that may change. We'll have to see if any new enemy faction decks pop up, as all the promos support those factions, not the ones that have already been established. I still believe Elysian Midrange is a tier 2 deck, though it is definitely not at the top of tier 2. A few things I would like to see, and this is going into what direction the archetype could go, would be to experiment with the killer mechanic, using Predator's Instinct with Dawnwalkers, along with Predatory Carnosaur as your 6-drop of choice. Maybe even get a little jankier and throw in a bit of recursion with Excavate and getting Copper Conduit in the mix of that as well. Sort of an Elysian Killer style deck. It sucks that we'd be stealing Xenon Killer's Thunder a little bit, if that idea is viable. So I apologize in advance to any Xenon Killer aficionados. But since I'm mentioning Xenon Killers, another idea that could be toyed with would just be splashing Shadow into this deck and taking aspects from both Elysian Midrange and Xenon Killers. A sort of dark Elysian, if you will. I have no idea what a list would look like, though, for that. I imagine some amount of Dark Return, some spot removal like Annihilator, Death Strike, and maybe Argenport Instigator as a 2-drop, since that's the best 2-drop in the game, I would say. But just some ideas that are in my head. Don't know if they're necessarily viable or not, but just some things that I kind of want to see people mess with. I may mess with it myself, who knows. But anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. For those that made it to the end, thank you so much for listening to my thoughts on Elysian Midrange, as this was pretty long. If there's anything you thought I missed, or you just want to continue the discussion in general, please leave comments in the comment section below. I want to know what you guys think. Please leave feedback as well if you want to see more videos like this one from me, or tell me what I can improve on. And feel free to like the video if you liked it. Feel free to dislike it if you didn't. But again, thanks for taking your time out to watch this, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Take care, guys.